I made the title of this live stream. Um, I finally figured out Dr. Roy Casagranda, because I think I have. And I'm very excited about this because it was really bothering me. I could not figure him out. If you remember last time, if you saw so little recap, if you weren't here or whatever, a year ago, Ibn Sina on Discord asked me to review or to react to this video, The Crusades Part 1, Political Origins of Proto-Crusades, 1061 to 1108, which is it's part of a 4-lecture series on the Crusades. This one covers the First Crusade. And I watched it, and then the next day I reacted to it on the stream, and I had very negative things to say. And then a couple weeks ago, I posted it, or maybe it was a week ago, I don't remember. I posted it on YouTube. At the time when I was doing the stream, I couldn't figure him out because he was saying stuff that was so incredibly wrong. And throughout the entire stream, I'm like, because what I show in the stream is how I felt at the time. Like when I was watching it the first time, I was watching him say these crazy anecdotes, and I'm like, I know that's not true, but I don't know where he got it. And he must have read it in some weird book, some fringe, like something. Maybe he saw it in a cartoon when he was a kid or something. He's getting this stuff from somewhere, I don't know where. And then I just kept giving him the benefit of the doubt, benefit of the doubt all through the stream. And then through the video when I was first watching it. And then I finally got to that point where he tells this whole story about something that happened during the sack of Jerusalem, which could not possibly have happened because the Christians weren't there. And I snapped because I'm like, there's no way that, where is this coming from? I was freaking out. And so, and that really troubled me because I'm like, if he's making this stuff up out of thin air and then he's delivering in the classroom and he's very confident that it happened, I've never met anybody like that I know of. I've never seen anybody like that I know of. And I was really troubled. What kind of person is this? What kind of psyche is this? But when I posted it on YouTube, there were comments under the YouTube video, and every once in a while, one of them would say, here's where he's getting this information. And then then the pieces started to click together for me. Oh, okay, I think I understand what's happening now. So I'm going to talk about this in the course of this stream. His anecdote on Ireland being connected to Iran etymologically is very funny to me, and I looked up where he got it from. Yeah, see, that's that. And I'm going to talk about a similar thing, which is his whole Indo-European Swedes come from Iran thing. I'm going to talk about that first. Benadir, is he not just the type of guy that everyone knows that loves lying who wasn't filtered out by academia? I'm not sure. I think it'll become more clear as we go along what's going on. I no longer think that he loves lying. Now I think he's just really sloppy. And also good at storytelling. And I think in his mind, he has a certain shortcut, a certain like ideological shortcut that he's doing that makes him think that even if he gets some of the details wrong, it's okay because the big picture is still, the gist of it is still right. I'll get to that later if I remember. Bad BS detector. Yeah, that's probably true. But because he's letting his like worldview or his belief system, that's filtering reality for him. And so that's making it harder for him to detect BS. And also like he's doing Crusades, he doesn't know the material, he doesn't know the historiography. And so he's just way outside of his comfort zone in terms of knowing what he knows. This is not in any way an explanation for why he got the Arian controversy so wrong at the end of that stream in that other video. So I may not have entirely figured him out, but I do feel like I'm closer to understanding, and more like the mental model I have now is it takes better account of the data I've seen. Okay, I'm gonna start getting into this now. Oh my gosh, Joyce, I didn't realize that his tongue was out. My apologies to Dr. Roy Casagranda. Over, okay. Oh, Lightning Bolt, you're taking a Crusades class. Nice. I hope they have not assigned the book that he's using. That would be bad. Actually, I would be kind of curious if you tell me what the books are that are assigned. He's so rabidly anti-Christian European that he ridicules himself. That's it. He's anti-European. He's anti-West, anti-Christian, maybe. I mean, he's basically anti-Catholic in this video, in this lecture about the Crusades. I'm assuming that's because it's part of a larger kind of anti-West thing. His point of view, he's a political activist, big on the, he's an advocate for Palestinian rights in the Arab-Israeli conflict. He, I would assume, took Iraq's side in the Iraq War. I don't know, but he's that kind of person. But I've known people who are very politically engaged and feel very passionately about Arab and Muslim causes in a geopolitical sense, and that seems to be what he is. Like that seems to be his thing, and I think that's the lens through which he's seeing the Crusades, because he's seeing the Crusades as another act of European aggression against the Islamic world, which is kind of it's a thing that is out there. There's a theory that's out there. I don't think it's fair. I don't think not fair from the standpoint of, oh, those poor Crusaders, but fair from the standpoint of, I don't think it's a, let me put it a different way, a critically rigorous way of thinking about the Crusades. It's too reductionist and too simplistic and anachronistic to say that the Crusades were European imperialism. That they were the same thing as when the British and French were establishing the colonial empires in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that the Crusades were the same thing because the Europeans have somehow always been doing that. That's a pseudo-historical way of thinking, which unfortunately some people in academia have that view because they don't work in medieval studies or Crusade studies or whatever. They don't know anything about the Middle Ages. They work in modern day poli-sci and sociology stuff. Like those are kind of their fields, and they don't know how to think like a historian. And so they have a tendency that many people have, including many people in the social sciences, of flattening the past. Anyway, I don't want to go off. I want to like get to this content. This pause isn't much better. Oh no. Okay, so Lightning Bolt, like 90% of the readings are just primary sources. Oh, that's cool. That's nice. Do you think that his German etymological link is an effort to put down an identity? Put down the Germanic identity? No, I don't think so. Actually, that's the part we're going to do right now. Let me go to that part. Oh, before I do that, I need to show a slide. I need to talk through what I'm... Oh, no. Joyce is going to be like, that's not a good one either. Let's try to find a good one. That's good. That's a good one. Right, so and I'm going to have to change scenes, so hopefully I'm not going to mess this up. Okay. When you take a college class, the professor is going to tell you a bunch of stuff that professor has not personally researched, in the sense of diving into the primary sources and exploring the historiography and being familiar with what the different historians who work in the field have said and the different historiographical schools of thought in that whatever. What they've done, that professor has gone and read hopefully 2 or 3 books on the topic, maybe less, Maybe the professor's relying solely on what the textbook that they assigned, whatever. But generally speaking, the content that you're getting in the college classroom, the professor got it from secondary sources, meaning books that were written by modern day people, modern day historians, hopefully historians if it's a history class, although sometimes not. I'll be mentioning that in a minute. But secondary sources are works of history that are written by modern day historians, and then they rely on primary sources, ideally, and also other secondary sources to get their information. Will this be on the exam? Yes, it will. Primary sources are the sources that were written back then, back hundreds of years ago. This is a kind of a general, very basic overview. You can have primary sources that are actually secondary sources and so on. You can get more complicated, but this is basically the thing. Every professor relies on books that he had to read that other professors wrote that are actually experts on that, right? Because if a professor only teaches what he or she has personally researched and is steeped in academically, then the course is going to be very, very narrow, and you're not going to have the availability of the range of courses. Although I have heard of places where they'll let their professors teach something that's specifically in their field, and if you look at their course catalog, there's a lot of really, really niche stuff. Like on top of those would be the upper division classes, right? So the lower division classes, the survey classes are always still going to be broad introductory level surveys that the professor has to rely on secondary sources for. This is very normal, and Dr. Roy Casagranda does it too. And he's not at fault for doing that. That's just a normal thing. So here is what my theory for Dr. Roy Casagranda in relation to the Crusades class. This is what's going on. He's relying primarily on Amin Maalouf, a particular author from the 20th century. I think he's still alive, but he wrote in the 20th century. And, I did that. How did I do that? Okay. And then Amin Maalouf wrote a book. He wrote a book in the early 80s, and he was using primary and secondary sources for his book. Okay, so what's the book? Amin Maalouf was a Lebanese journalist. Let me switch back to the other thing. Video management's really a challenge for me. Okay, so this is the book, The Crusades Through Arab Eyes. There's a Wikipedia article about it. This is the original French cover, and then it was translated to English the following year. This is from the early 80s. And this became a very popular book about the Crusades. Yeah, right, lightning bolt. See, history always has a clear-cut good guy and bad guy, and the goal of historians is to find out which is which. So, Amin Maalouf's book, The Crusades Through Arab Eyes, it is what the title suggests. It's the Crusades through Arab eyes. And what he does is, if we go back to the slide, he's using primary and secondary sources. The primary sources that he's looking at are Islamic sources, Arab chroniclers who wrote in the period of the Crusades and a little bit after, who talked about the Crusades. And that was something that was not accessible very easily to an English reading public prior to this. Because prior to this book being published, the only book that I know of that was available in English that gave the perspective of the Arabs in terms of this is what Arab historians wrote about the Crusades, was an anthology of translated primary sources that was edited by Gabrielli, who was a mid 20th century Orientalist from Italy. and he did it in Italian, and then it was translated into English or whatever, done into English. But that was the only thing you had if you wanted to learn about the Crusades. It's not super user friendly. It's more suitable for a classroom where the professor like is as a textbook, like to serve with the in relation to the classroom setting. It's not something that a general reader out in the world can pick up and read and get a lot out of unless you're really into primary sources. And so Amin Maalouf published this book, and it made the Islamic perspective, the Arabic perspective on the Crusades, very accessible to English speakers. I mean, it was published in French first, then translated to English, and then in the English translation was very popular, and it was widely assigned in classes. Now, the problem is Amin Maalouf is a journalist, not a historian. He writes in a very sensationalist kind of way, and the way he depicts the Crusades, he's not doing any kind of historical analysis. It's simply a good versus evil story where the good guys are the Muslims and the bad guys are the Crusaders. The Crusaders are pure evil. They're savage monsters. They're not really human in his book. They're treated like a force of nature, not like human beings, where they just go around killing, and he spends a long time talking about the cannibalism episode in Ma'ara. But like just talking about all like burning cities and killing everybody. And as far as Amin Maalouf was concerned, the Crusaders were all they were there for was to kill people just for the funsies. Like there was no other reason why the Crusaders were doing anything. They just wanted to go to the Middle East and kill Muslims, and they were so racist they couldn't tell the difference between Arab Christians and Arab Muslims, and they just killed everybody. That's essentially his whole deal. But it was very popular, and a lot of people read it, and it's still popular today. And it's really unfortunate, especially considering that there are new books now that do a better job. So there's a book, I didn't prepare this. I didn't prepare a slide or a tab or anything for this, but the book is called The Race for Paradise. Let's see if I can find it. This book, The Race for Paradise, An Islamic History of the Crusades by Paul M. Cobb. Paul M. Cobb is an actual historian who can do history. This is an excellent book. So if you want, like, don't read Amin Maalouf. Amin Maalouf is a completely garbage book now. It's worthless. Like, the value it had before was it gave the Islamic perspective when there was no other book that you could do that for. But that's no longer the case. Crusader studies has moved a long way since the 1980s. There are a lot more resources now. And now Amin Maalouf's book is completely superseded, and it's just pulp now. There's no other reason to ever read or look at that book. So this is the book, The Race for Paradise. Another book, since I'm talking about this, by Carol Hillenbrand. Islamic Crusades, Islamic Perspectives. Let's see if it comes up. This book, yeah, The Crusades, Islamic Perspectives by Carol Hillenbrand, which I believe is out of print, and it's been out of print for a while, which is unfortunate. You'll have to buy it on the secondary market. Excellent, excellent book. Much thicker, much bigger, lots of pictures, so it's kind of expensive, but well worth it. If you're interested in the Crusades, you get a really good perspective on the Islamic perspective on the Crusades. So Amin Maalouf, if you own it, throw it away. It's garbage. I own it, so I'm being a hypocrite, but I actually couldn't find it. I was actually looking for it to get ready for this, because I bought it when I was in grad school. I bought Crusades Through Arab Eyes by Amin Maalouf. I'm like, this is a really popular book. I should be familiar with it. I started to read it, and at that point, I had already been learning about the Crusades in grad school, and I recognized right away that it's garbage. He just makes stuff up. He dramatizes. He does the historical fiction thing where he talks about people's emotions and stuff, but it's purely like he's just making it up. And then he really mangles, like he reports the Arab sources decently enough, but he completely mangles the Crusaders and what their deal was and like what their motivations were, or any, like, he doesn't know that stuff at all. And he's primarily relying on another book, Runciman, Stephen Runciman. Now let me talk about this book for a second, because this is going to be relevant later on in the lecture, in the stream. Stephen Runciman was a historian in the 20th century who wrote this book called History of the Crusades. It was a 3-volume set, published in the 1950s. And this became the standard work on the Crusades for history, for English speakers in the mid to late 20th century. Everybody who, like, if you met somebody who was kind of like a fairly well-educated person, who was kind of had a well-rounded education, liked to read about history, typically they had read one work on the Crusades, and it was this. Or they read the 1-volume version. There was a 1-volume extract from the first volume. First volume of this 3-volume set is about the First Crusade. Part of it was extracted to make this little guy, which is a very readable and approachable version. This was published in 1980. And now Runciman was a historian. He did study history at Oxbridge. Which one? Cambridge, I think. Let me see. One of those. I don't remember. Oh, it's not on this one. I think he went to Cambridge and studied history, but he did not work as a historian because he didn't need to, because he was independently wealthy. And so when he finished his education, he just wrote books. And this is his most famous one. Now, Runciman was obsessed with the Byzantine Empire. He loved the Byzantine Empire. He was a Byzantinophile. Thought they were the greatest thing ever. And so he had a grudge against the Crusades because of the Fourth Crusade, which he blamed. He said the Byzantine Empire was wrecked because of the Fourth Crusade. It was all their fault. And so he was angry and never forgave them for it. And he also had this kind of like way of oversimplifying the Crusaders, treating them like barbaric, savage, bloodthirsty, conniving, untrustworthy. And in fact, if I'm saying all those adjectives and you're like, well, yeah, isn't that what the Crusaders were? I thought that's what the Crusaders were. I thought everybody knew that. You have Runciman to thank for believing that, because he published this 3-volume set, which became the most accessible, and also was like well researched and stuff. It became the gold standard for like everybody. Like I said, everybody who was learning about the Crusades would read Runciman. And so Runciman shaped generations of people of how they perceive the Crusades. And so now that's how people perceive the Crusades. People who are outside of Crusade studies. People who are inside Crusade studies, who do Crusades as their academic field. That's not my field, but I was following it in grad school, and I try to keep up with it. The researchers, the actual academics who work in Crusade history, don't think that way about the Crusaders. And the actual academic work is very interesting, and they treat the Crusaders. It's like my quote from the video about Africa. Why was there no wheel in Africa? And I said in that video, let's assume for the sake of argument that Europeans are human beings. And that's my point of view. Let's assume for the sake of argument that Europeans are human beings, including the Europeans who went on the Crusades, that they were human beings. They weren't just monsters. They weren't just bloodthirsty lunatics or like animals. You know, they were human beings. And you see the humanity of them when you read the academic literature, but you don't really see it so much in the popular imagination. And then that's reflected. Runciman's book is not completely bad. I wouldn't say don't read it, but you should take it with a grain of salt. You should be aware that he very much had an axe to grind and wanted to, and was really like, was almost being polemical in the way that he was writing it. But it is actual history work, unlike Amin Maalouf. Because this book is just garbage. He's a journalist, and he wrote it, and he was very sensationalizing it. But Amin Maalouf relied very heavily on Runciman. But of course, Amin Maalouf was reading Runciman and then already had this prejudice against Westerners because of imperialism. And so he was filtering everything he read in Runciman through a lens that actually intensified the dehumanization of the Crusaders. And then that's what ends up in his book. And then my thesis is that's where Dr. Casagranda is basing his. Dr. Casagranda is not did not choose to hate the Crusaders because of what he read in Amin Maalouf, probably, unless Amin Maalouf was his gateway to Middle Eastern history. I think instead, Amin Maalouf confirms Dr. Roy Casagranda's prejudices against European imperialism, and his prejudice to say that the Islamic civilization was perfect and wonderful, and Western civilization is evil and horrible. I'm sure he has some nuance there, but basically, and so but the material. So he has that framework that he's working with, but then the material that he's delivering in the classroom is partially remembered tidbits of information that he read primarily in Crusades Through Arab Eyes. That's my thesis. That's my theory. I can't prove it at this point. I would have to watch a bunch more of Dr. Roy Casagranda's content, and I don't want to do that. And I'd have to read Amin Maalouf, and I really don't want to do that. So, but that's my working theory. Let me switch back over here. Okay. You could also just email him and ask how he prepared to the lectures. Oh, I guess you could. I don't want to put him on the spot, though. So the Crusades are not his field, and like I said in the beginning, going back here. Oh, there. Going back to this, remember, every professor relies on this. So the fact that Dr. Roy Casagranda doesn't know the Crusades as a field, and he's like, well, I need to teach the Crusades, or I want to teach the Crusades. He goes and reads this. It's actually not far-fetched that he would be put in the direction of reading Amin Maalouf, because it's a very popular book. It's the kind of book that does get assigned in college classes still today because of inertia, because maybe professors, I don't know why. And so, yeah, he'd be like, well, I want to learn about it. And he's, of course, a Middle East guy. So naturally, he would want to read it from their perspective. And he's reading Maalouf. And of course, for him, reading Maalouf's purple prose it's not going to bother him, because they share the same outlook. They share the same prejudices. So he's going to be like, yeah, sure, all this stuff must be true. Lightning Bolt, do you care about accuracy in history movies? Kind of. It depends. I think you can usually, there are sometimes it depends on the kind of accuracy you're talking about, because sometimes you'll have to compress events or combine events for the sake of the simplicity of the narrative. But I think a lot of times when someone adapts a historical event for movies, they make changes that are not really necessary. It's just they didn't want to do the research or something. It's kind of like when J.J. Abrams basically tried to do a reboot of Star Wars when he did his Episode 7. It's not because Star Wars needed that. He could have made a sequel trilogy that was faithful to the other to Lucas's vision and to the other movies. He just didn't want to read the extra canonical stuff from the Star Wars universe. He just didn't want to learn any of that stuff. And so he threw it all away. It just made it easier for him. He could just make something up out of thin air, out of his mystery box. It's the same way with history. Like, you can make history stories that are really compelling and amazing, but you have to read. People don't want to read. Lightning Bolt, I'm so sad we'll never see the Lucas sequels. Yeah, I am too. Okay, let me get into this. So under the YouTube video, there were some people that were leaving comments saying, oh, he got this from this and he got this from this. None of them actually mentioned Amin Maalouf. But when they were saying that, that got the wheels turning for me. It's like, okay, there might be something that he, yeah. So that I kind of thought about it and looked. I figured out, oh, it must have been Amin Maalouf. Okay, but first of all, and let me look at my notes. So several of the comments under that video talked about his claim of Swedish people coming from Iran. And that seems to be like what I think is going on there is he's taking little bits of information from different things and he's combining them in his mind and creating a story out of it. So he kind of understands the Indo-European migrations, but not really. He has another video about Cyrus the Great that came out recently that I watched the first part of. And in that, he talks about the Indo-European migrations and gets them wrong. He thinks the Indo-Europeans started in Kazakhstan, went down through Iran, and then, and some of them went to India, and some went to Iran, and then some of them continued on through the Caucasus up into Europe. That's what he thinks happened. At least that's, as I recall, that's what he says in that other video. And I suspect that's connected with his belief that the Swedes come from Iran, because he's probably thinking, well, the Germanic people came from Iran during that migration. And so anyway, this is the part where he's talking about the Swedes. Let me go over here. So we're going to listen to this part now.
Was they set out to start trading. They thought, you know what, we can fix our problem if we can do trade because we'll have the money to buy the food that we need. And the Eastern Vikings, the Swedes, got so into this, they actually started trying to figure out where they could go to, and they started reading their sagas. This is the 8th century. They're not reading their sagas, they were oral histories. They were listening to their sagas. And the sagas told the Vikings that the place the Germans were from was Iran.
Yeah, so that's what he says here. And what's that from? Well, there were several people in the comments of that video who said, oh, this sounds like Snorri Sturluson, who wrote the Prose Edda. In the Prose Edda was, so Snorri Sturluson was a guy in Iceland in the early 13th century who wrote about the old pre-Christian lore. Now, in the 13th century, Iceland was Christianized, had already been Christianized, there have been Christians there for generations. But he wrote about the old lore of like the pre-Christian mythology. And he was recording it because he didn't want that knowledge to be lost. And he, in that work, one of the things he says is that the Norse gods, like Thor and Odin and stuff, those were actually Trojans from the city of Troy, who left Troy, I guess, after the Trojan War and the destruction of Troy. They left and they went north to what we now know as Scandinavia. And they became, like, over the generations, their descendants came to think of them as gods, and that was the origin of the Norse mythology. Now, Troy is not Iran. Troy is in Asia Minor. So there's not a direct connection between what the Prose Edda says and what Dr. Roy Casagranda is saying here. I don't think that he read the Prose Edda. I don't think that's where he's getting it from directly. I think he read other stuff, secondary sources, that were then drawing upon the Prose Edda. I don't have a lot to say about that because that's not, I don't know much about Norse stuff, and I have not dived into, like, apparently I was trying to research this online. I was trying to figure out what the connections might be, and I was seeing references to pseudo-scientific theories in the late 19th or early 20th centuries of Europeans who were speculating that the Aryans, the Aryan migrations, and the Scandinavians were Aryans, and the Aryans were also connected with Iran somehow, and so there was some kind of like pseudoscientific stuff going on there. I don't know though, because I wasn't able to identify stuff and like really dive into that. But he does mention at some point, I think in that other lecture I watched about Cyrus the Great, I think he talks about the term Aryan. I think he does say, I'm going to use the term Aryan because I think it's a better term and we should reclaim it from the Nazis. So that's circumstantial evidence to me that it might be that somehow he picked up on these old theories, read them somewhere or something. That would seem to fit his model that the Indo-European migrations went through Iran on the way to Europe. It's actually really interesting how all these relatively minor historical misconceptions have all tied themselves together in his mind. Yes, and I would say that this is his creativity. This is his contribution. He's picking up these little tidbits here and there. And then, I mean, I would say that he's an intelligent person. I would not say that he's not intelligent. And I would say that he has an intelligence for storytelling and for constructing and for I guess systematizing and like pattern finding or whatever, but also for storytelling. He can construct. He vaguely remembers, he has this kind of like awareness that the ancient Norse would had sagas. He has this awareness that the word Iran is connected to the word Aryan. He has this awareness of the Indo-European migrations. These are all like isolated little bits, little factoids. And then he's putting them together in a creative way to create a story that's easily consumable for a student. I want Dr. Roy Casagranda to write historical novels instead. I'd read the... Yeah, well, and he does. He writes them. Actually, in this lecture, he mentions his novel. And I think it talks about it. I think he mentions it on his website or something. I remember seeing a family tree that combined all of these claims, and the result was that every contemporary European monarch is descended from Hector, Moses, Caesar, Odin, ancient... Yeah, that's right. That's right. There were there's a good video. There are a couple of videos that I watched a few days ago preparing for this by Dr. Jackson Crawford, and he talks about Snorri Sturluson and stuff, and he does mention that like everybody in Europe was connecting themselves with the Trojans, the Welsh and the Albanians and everybody. Oh my gosh, you've just sold 2 of Dr. Casagranda's books. That's hilarious. No, he can keep the commission on me. I'll do free marketing for him. Okay, I don't have much to add to this section. I just wanted to point that out because several people in the comments recognized that, and so I wanted to like, for the record, there seems to be a connection here. But it's very different. Snorri Sturluson doesn't say anything about Iran, and he doesn't say anything about migrations. Well, I guess the Trojans migrated to Sweden or whatever, he doesn't say Sweden specifically. But it's Troy, and it's connected with the Trojan War, and it's obviously, I mean, if in context, it's obviously not real. This is where the pseudoscience was coming in, because pseudoscientists were like imagining it was real, that there was an actual historical migration, and they were thinking this might be a historical memory. But there's no way Snorri Sturluson was doing that. He was writing hundreds of years after the fact. He was clearly just trying to account for the existence of this belief in Norse gods before they Christianized. He was trying to explain it in terms that made sense to a medieval person, a medieval European, a cultured, literary medieval European knew about the Trojan War and the Aeneid, and that was part of their kind of world history framework in their mind. That's where Snorri Sturluson was coming from. He was connecting the Norse culture to that broader literate culture of European civilization. That's all it was. And so those pseudo those scholars in a sense, but the guys back 100 years ago, 150 years ago, they were exercising, they were using poor judgment and thinking that there could actually be a historical basis for this idea that they came from Troy. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two things. This wasn't about the Crusades. This was in his background information leading up to talking about the Crusades. He was talking about Vikings. But okay, we're going to move on. We're going to go to the Crusades themselves. And there are two events in the First Crusade that we're going to look at. We're going to see what he says, and then I'm going to try to trace back where that comes from and compare that to the primary sources. So the first is actually an event that I did not highlight in my last stream. It is the capture of Antioch in 1098. I skipped over Antioch when I reacted to his video the first time. But I want to talk about it here because it's an easy, convenient way of illustrating how wrong he is and the contrast between his wrongness and what the sources say, and also where, like, what the genealogy of his wrongness might be. And then the second one will be the supposed event where during the sack of Jerusalem in 1099, the Crusaders went into the Christian quarters and started killing the Christians and told the Christians, we're going to kill all of you unless you give us the true cross. So I'm going to talk about that too, and trace the genealogy of his story. So the Antioch thing. Right here. So, I don't remember where he is. Okay, yeah. So here's what happened with Antioch. So the get a map. All right. The Crusades. Oh, let me change my cursor and make my cursor bigger. Right. All right. Yeah. So now it's nice and big. Okay. So the Crusades began up here. Some of the Crusaders came from South Italy. This is the First Crusade, I mean. Other Crusaders came from this area up here. And they traveled different routes to Constantinople, which was here, and then crossed the water into Asia Minor, traversed Asia Minor, and came to Antioch, which is right here. Antioch today is called Hatay. That's the Turkish name for it. And yeah, so this is where Antioch is. And when they arrived, at the time that they arrived, Antioch was under Turkish control. Not Turkish like Turkey. The modern country of Turkey didn't exist back then. The Turks came from out here in Asia, and they migrated into the Middle East in the 11th century. Some Turks were actually coming in earlier than that as slaves in the Umayyad and Abbasid periods when this was, so the Islam expanded, the Arabs conquered all of this, and then the Abbasid thing happened, and they were importing Turks from Central Asia as slaves. But that's so that's earlier on. In the 11th century, Turks migrated in and established political control of this area. They were called the Seljuks. And then some of the Turks kept going westward and attacked and conquered these areas here. Asia Minor at the time, or what is now Turkey, was Byzantine territory. The people there were Christians, and they spoke Greek. And they were thoroughly Byzantine Roman people. They were not Turks at all until the Turks came in the late 1000s. And so they invaded Asia Minor, and they conquered all this territory from the Byzantines. They also conquered down here. This area there had been little principalities and the Ottomans had controlled part of this. I don't remember how far up they went. But they also conquered this area. And the reason the First Crusade was called was because of this, because the Turks were coming in and invading here. There were stories going back to Europe of Christian pilgrims, because Christians would travel on pilgrimage to Jerusalem and the neighboring region in the Middle Ages. All through the Middle Ages, they were doing that. And at the time the Turks were invading, these pilgrims were coming back to Europe with stories of how the Turks had attacked them, had mutilated them, killed them, raped them. I'm not supposed to say that on stream, am I? But just brutalizing them, enslaving them, and some of them were escaping and going. And this was upsetting the people up here in Europe. And at the same time, the Turks were invading Asia Minor and taking territory from the Byzantines. So the Byzantines sent word back. The Byzantine Emperor Alexius sent back to Rome not in Rome, the Pope, who was not in Rome at the time, but anyway, sent back to the Pope asking him to organize an army, not to organize personally, but to talk to the nobility, the high nobility in Europe, get them to put an army together and go and help him regain control in Asia Minor. So that was the impetus for the First Crusade. And so these crusaders came from these different regions, marched down, and they arrived in Antioch. So Antioch was recently conquered by the Turks. It had been under Byzantine control before the Turks arrived. And the population of the city, I don't know for sure. I don't know if anybody really knows for sure what the demographics of the city were, but according to a historian later on named William of Tyre, it was a majority Christian city. It was almost entirely Christian according to him. Maybe that's true. I don't know. I would think there must have been some kind of Muslims living there, but it was probably primarily a Christian population. So the Turks had been in control of the city for 13 years when the Crusaders arrived. And so they were laying siege to a city that had a Christian population primarily with a Turkish garrison. There was a Turkish population, but they were there as part of the occupying power. The armies of the First Crusade were also largely peasants and not the stereotypical knights we think of later on. There were two separate waves of the First Crusade. They're called the People's Crusade and the Prince's Crusade. When the First Crusade was called, it became very popular as a devotional thing to go and do this. And so a lot of people wanted to go who were not equipped to go militarily. And so there was one wave that was the People's Crusade that went first, while the noblemen up in here in South Italy, they were getting things prepped. And then they left later. So there were two different waves. But the crusade that got to Antioch was the Prince's Crusade. They were an army. I mean, but the army would have included peasants who were, armies back then were not standing professional armies like we have now. You would have, you had the warrior class knights that would basically train regularly, but then the army would also consist of peasants who were serving out of a duty. They had a legal duty to serve, and so they would go along. They did not have professional training. So in that sense, yeah, they were peasants. Okay, so devotionally getting killed by the Turks. Yeah, basically, yeah. Okay, so that was all right. So they got to Antioch. They laid siege to the city. Siege lasted for a number of months. And then one of the Crusader leaders was named Bohemond. He made contact with a guy on the inside named Firuz. And they were in communication for a while. I don't know how long. Weeks, probably. And they finally arranged, it was all arranged, that they were going to storm the city on a certain night. Firuz was going to let down a ladder or a rope. The different primary sources are a little bit, there's some differences in the primary sources about exactly what the implement was. Some kind of rope ladder or a rigid ladder or something. There was some kind of ladder. Firuz had control of a window, or had control of a certain section of the fortification. There was a window. He let Bohemund's men in, up into this window, and then gates were opened, and the Crusaders rushed in, and they grabbed the city. So that's where we are at this stage of the lecture, I believe.
Shams is beautiful, but of the state? Anyway, he's got the citadel, and he's holding on to it. He's like, okay, they've got the city, but he's also watching what the Crusaders are doing in the city. They're not kind conquerors. They're not walking through and going, oh, hi, everybody, how's it going? They are murdering everybody. They're just going through the streets, slaughtering the inhabitants of Antioch. They're killing the men. They're killing the elderly. They're killing the women. They're killing the babies. They're leaving nobody. And Shams is up there in the citadel going, who are these people? Why are they doing this? Why wouldn't you want the city intact? Somebody to tax, somebody to work for you. Why are you slaughtering the city? And there's nothing you can do about it except resist and hold on to the citadel. And that's when Karbuka's army shows up. Too late.
All right, so that's what he says. That's how he presents what happened when the Crusaders got into the city. They went around and killed everybody in the city. And he references this again later on in the lecture a couple times, how the Crusaders had exterminated the entire population of Antioch. And he puts words into the mouth of Shams ad-Dawla, who was in control, kind of leading the Turkish defense at that point. And obviously we don't have any record of Shams ad-Dawla saying whatever. He's putting that dialogue in his mouth, but he's saying, like, why would they do that? Why would they kill everybody in the city? Why would you not want somebody to work for you, these people to work for you, to pay you taxes? So in Dr. Roy Casagranda doesn't have an answer to that. He himself is kind of dumbfounded that the Crusaders would go and kill the entire population of the city. Why would they do that? He's like, that's crazy. Now, I believe that the basis for this anecdote comes from Maalouf. Let me bring that up. All right, so here's what Maalouf says about that, about they got into the city and what happened when the Crusaders got into the city of Antioch. The city itself was a scene of blood and fire. Men, women, and children tried to flee through muddy alleyways, but the knights tracked them down easily and slaughtered them on the spot. The last survivors' cries of horror were gradually extinguished, soon to be replaced by the off-key singing of drunken Frankish plunderers. Smoke rose from the many burning houses. By midday, a veil of mourning enveloped the city. So you can see what I mean by he's a journalist writing in a very sensational way. He's trying to engage your emotions. He's trying to get the reader to have an emotional response. And he's being very creative. He's doing a historical fiction type thing. He's talking about muddy alleyways. The knights were tracking people down. The last survivors were crying in horror. The Frankish plunderers, the singing of drunken Frankish plunderers. I'm not aware of any source that has any of those details in it, and I'm not an expert on it. There might be something I missed, but I think a more likely explanation, an Occam's razor explanation for why all these details are in here, is not because Amin Maalouf read some obscure thing about the siege of Antioch that I haven't read. I think he's making it up. Like he makes up everything else in the book. Not everything, but he makes up there's a ton of stuff in the book that he makes up. And it's this kind of stuff. Like the basic facts are there. The Crusaders did capture the city. That's true. There was fighting in Jerusalem, inside of Antioch at the time that they entered the city. That's true. All that's true. And then he's creating this story to make it a gripping tale. Now notice, though, in this paragraph, he does not say that the Crusaders killed everybody in the city. He just says they were going around killing people. But he does say they were killing men, women, and children. He doesn't specify which men, women, and children or why. He says they were tracking them down in order to kill them. He says the last survivors' cries of horror were gradually extinguished. Actually, the more I look at this, the more I think he's kind of implying that everybody in the city was killed, isn't he? The last survivors' cries of horror were gradually extinguished. Okay, so I guess he doesn't come out and say that he killed everybody, that they killed everybody in the city, but he is kind of implying that. So I don't have any direct evidence that Dr. Roy Casagranda read the Crusades through Arab eyes. It just seems circumstantially, it seems to line up. He's saying something that's kind of similar, and it's the kind of book that he would want to read because he's a Middle East guy. He studies the Middle East. He cares about the Middle East. He's an activist in Middle East causes. He hates the West because of imperialism. So it all lines up that this is the kind of book that Dr. Roy Casagranda would read and would take, he would believe, Oh man, 4 unskippable ads. I'm sorry about that. This, by the way, this format is not a format I will typically be doing on Twitch. Typically, I will be gaming on Twitch. I'm just doing this here because I did the original one here and because I have everything set up for Twitch. Eventually, I will be doing some streaming on Boring Premodernist on my second YouTube channel. If I can carve out the time for it, and if I can make this a consistent series, it might just be once a month at first or something like that. But I will start doing streams over there. And the streams I do over there will be more of this style of like, if I'm talking about something that's somewhat academic, I'm going to do it over on YouTube, not here. What was the second channel YouTube name again? I missed it. Boring Premodernist. Boring, because I'm going to talk about books and stuff, which are, boring. All right. Oh, yeah, flags. I will still do flags here on Twitch. My flag news streams will still be here. I do that every couple of months. All right, let's get back to this. All right. So we looked at Amin Maalouf. And where is Amin Maalouf getting this from? That's the next question. What's his basis for this? I don't know. I don't know for sure. But I said earlier on he was getting stuff from Runciman in general. He relied on Runciman for his Western stuff. We're talking about the Crusades. So we can look real quick at what he said about what Runciman says about it. Runciman says this: by nightfall on 3rd June, there was no Turk left alive at Antioch. Even from neighboring villages to which the Franks had never penetrated, the Turkish population had fled to seek refuge with Kerboga. The houses of the citizens of Antioch, of Christians as well as of Muslims, were pillaged. The treasures and the arms found there were scattered or wantonly destroyed. You could not walk in the streets without treading on corpses, all of them rotting rapidly in the summer heat. Antioch was Christian once more. And actually, that little taste of it, you can kind of see a little bit of his style. It's still, he's scholarly in the sense that he is relating stuff that's in the sources. The details that are in here, there are details in here that are reported in his sources. You'll notice he does have a footnote. And he lists the primary sources where he's getting this information. But at the same time, he has an axe to grind. Notice this sarcastic line at the end, but Antioch was Christian once more, which reflects his view. He has this very cynical view of the Crusaders. Crusaders were only driven, like, they were hypocritical about religion. They were bloodthirsty maniacs, and which is a completely non-Christian thing for them to do. And so, like, there's something deeply hypocritical and wrong and cynical about what the Crusaders were doing. But since they were doing, but this, like, this hypocrisy, he's referencing that again. But Antioch was Christian. It was all worth it. He's like saying this sarcastically. For the Crusaders, it was all worth it because now Antioch was under Christian control again. But here, Runciman doesn't say the same thing that Maalouf says. You know, Maalouf has this like historical fiction vibe going on where they're going through the streets, tracking down men, women, and children in order to slaughter them. The cries of horror gradually die out as the survivors are tracked down and killed. Like, that's not happening here in Runciman. But Runciman says there was no Turk left alive in Antioch. Doesn't say anything about the Christian population. He says that the homes of Christians and Muslims were pillaged. I actually don't know where he gets this, by the way, but let's leave that aside. I suspect he's kind of misreading Raymond of Aguilera. You could not walk on the streets without treading on corpses. That's actually something one or two of the sources do say. And they smelled because they were rotting. That is in the primary sources. So he's talking about no Turk was left alive. There were corpses throughout the streets. And then based on that, apparently, Maalouf creates this scene of where they're just killing everybody. I have seen conservative commentators state how the Crusades were a logical result after 400 years of unrelenting Muslim expansion and war. How true would that be? I don't think so. I don't agree with that. I don't think that's how historical causation works. So, no, I think that's too simplistic. I do wonder how many Turks were present in Antioch in the first place. Yeah, we don't have numbers. I mean, the sources will sometimes say a number, but you can't trust that. So, we don't know. Probably a small number, although they had families, because the primary sources says that there were men and women Turks. They were both being killed by the Crusaders during that battle. Which makes sense. They'd been there for years. So it kind of makes sense they were just like moving in. They were living there. They had been living there for years. So yeah. But how many there were, I have no idea. Let's look at the primary sources for this incident. When the Crusaders got into the city and what happened in the city. So let me switch to that. Actually, I have notes. Keep track of all my things. Okay. I'm going to start with the Gesta Francorum, and we're going to have to do this in a window. So let me go back over here. We're going to look at this. Hopefully this works. Okay. I actually was going to read the part where they get into the... Yeah, actually, I think I will, because this gives a little bit of context. All right, so I'm going to start here. Okay, so by the way, the source. This is from the Gesta Francorum. This is one of our main eyewitness accounts of the First Crusade. It's anonymous, so that's why we don't reference an author. We just call it the Gesta Francorum, the deeds of the Franks. The deeds done by the Franks beyond the sea, or whatever it's called. I don't remember what the full name of it was. All right, yeah, so I'm going to read this. All the preparations were thus made. So this is like, it's the night where Bohemond has arranged that they're going to go in through the window. And so, yeah, this is what they're getting ready to do it. All the preparations were thus made. The knights went by the plain and the foot soldiers by the mountain, and they rode and marched all night until towards dawn, when they began to approach the towers of which Firuz, who had been watching all night, was warden. Then Bohemond dismounted at once and said to his men, "Go on, strong in heart and lucky in your comrades, and scale the ladder into Antioch, for by God's will we shall have it. We shall have it in our power in a trice." The men came to the ladder, which was already set up and lashed firmly to the battlements of the city, and nearly 60 of them went up it and occupied the towers which Firuz was guarding. But when Firuz saw that so few of our men had come up, he began to be afraid, fearing lest he and they should fall into the hands of the Turks, and he said in Greek, "Mikrous Francus echomen," which means, "We have few Franks." Where is the hero Bohemond? Where is that unconquered soldier? Meanwhile, a certain soldier from southern Italy went back down the ladder and ran as fast as he could to Bohemond, crying out, "Why are you standing here, sir, if you have any sense? What did you come to get? Look, we have taken 3 towers already." Bohemond and the others bestirred themselves, and they all came rejoicing to the ladder. When those who were in the towers saw them, they began to call out cheerfully, "God's will," and we called back the same words. Now an amazing number of men began to climb. They went up and ran quickly to the other towers. Whomsoever they found, they were put to death at once, killing the brother of Firuz among them. Meanwhile, the ladder, up which our men had climbed, happened to break, so that we were plunged in great despair and grief. However, although the ladder was broken, there was a gate not far from us to the left, but it was shut, and some of us did not know where it was, for it was still dark. Yet by fumbling with our hands and poking about, we found it, and all made a rush at it, so that we broke it down and entered. At this moment, the shrieks of countless people arose, making an amazing noise throughout the city. And I'll just pause here to clarify, because I was like, shrieks, what is that referring to? Because it sounds like shrieks of horror, shrieks of pain, what is that? But in the Latin is fragor, which means like tumult or uproar, like general noise, human noise. So people are shouting, there's confusion, stuff like that's going on. Bohemund did not waste time on this account, but ordered his glorious banner to be carried up to a hill opposite the citadel. All the people in the city were screaming at once. At dawn, our men who were outside in the tents heard an overpowering din break out in the city, so they hurried out and saw Bohemund's banner aloft on the hill. They all came running as fast as they could and entered the city gates, killing all the Turks and Saracens whom they found there, except for those who fled up to the citadel. Some other Turks got out through the gates and saved their lives by flight. Yagisian, their leader, who was much afraid of the Franks, took to flight headlong with many companions, and as they fled they came into Tancred's land not far from the city. Their horses were tired out, so they entered one of the villages and hid in a house. When the people who lived in that mountain, they were Syrians and Armenians, knew who the fugitive was, they captured him at once and cut off his head, which they took to my lord Bohemund as the price for their freedom. His belt and scabbard were worth 60 bezants. All this happened on the 3rd of June, which was a Thursday. All the streets of the city on every side were full of corpses, so that no one could endure to be there because of the stench, nor could anyone walk along the narrow paths of the city except over the corpses of the dead. Okay, so you can see, like, there are bits of, like, you can see where Runciman is getting some of his information, right? Like, there's some correlations there. But let's recap. Like, what is the gist of what the Gesta Francorum says about the events? So they went up the ladder. Some of them were able to get up the ladder, but the ladder broke. And they were going around to the towers, and they were killing the Turks that they were finding in the towers. Meanwhile, it's very dark. It's very dark. They go and try to find they hear that there's a gate, or some of them find out there's a gate, but they couldn't find it. So like they were like, it was so dark that they were like pawing around trying to find the gate in order to break it down. And then there was a general din of warfare, because, you know, like when people are realizing what's happening, they start shouting. And then they're going around, and any Turk or Saracen, which is Arab, any Turk or Arab they find, they kill. Now, how do they know? They would know based on clothing. That's not in the source, but that's like me like saying that's how they would know the difference. Yagisian fled. That's a famous story. Amin Maalouf talks about that in detail, about Yagisian's flight and how he ended up dying. Yeah, and so they end up taking the city, and the Turks have all either been killed, or they fled, or they made it to the citadel, and they're holing up in the citadel, which is this fortress area. So a citadel is like, you have a city that has a wall around it, and then there will be this one area of the city that's kind of like an extra fortified area, like a little mini castle or a castle inside the city, kind of a little fortress inside the city that has its own fortifications. So the Turkish garrison, those who were able to, fled up to the citadel to hole up in there. Others were killed in the streets, and then others had made it out of the city. That's what Gesta Francorum says. Is killing Firuz's brother a war crime? Yeah, we don't know why he was killed. This source and another source mention that his brother was killed, and they don't say why or what the circumstances were. And then there's William of Tyre, who lived in the Crusader states like several generations later, in the late 1100s, and he wrote a history of the Crusader states in the late 1100s, or history of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Um, but he's well after the fact. He's not an eyewitness of the First Crusade, but he would have known people who, you know, he would have met people who were participants. He had access to all the written accounts that were, around. He would have had access to a number of written accounts, and he clearly uses some of, you can tell when reading it where he's getting some of his information. Anyway, he's well after the fact. He does have an extended little anecdote about Firuz's brother, about how Firuz was, Firuz was going to give the city over to the Christians, over to the Crusaders, and he wasn't sure if his brother was going to be on board with that because, and he kind of sounded him out. And the brother, turns out the brother liked the Turks and hated the Crusaders, and so because of that, Firuz realized he couldn't trust him, and so when his brother fell asleep that night, the night of the plan, Firuz stabbed him. That's what William of Tyre says. I don't think anybody thinks that actually happened. I don't know if William of Tyre made it up or if he heard it from somebody. He probably heard it from somebody, but I don't know. So we don't know. We don't know what the deal was with Firuz's brother. Okay, so that's the Gesta Francorum. Let's look at another one now. So Albert of Aachen is another eyewitness account of the First Crusade. So at this point, I'm skipping a lot of that stuff where like they're coordinating and they're getting the ladder and whatever. Where we're coming in on Albert of Aachen's story is when, at the point the Bohemund's men have gotten into the city and they're starting to go around to the towers and killing the Turks. Meanwhile, while the Turks inside and outside were being hard-pressed in battle, the Greeks, Syrians, Armenians, citizens and men of the Christian faith rushed joyfully to break apart the bolts and to open the gates through which Bohemund and the whole army were admitted. Indeed, at first light, in that area where the betrayal of the city took place, Bohemund's banner, which was the color of blood, glowed redly over the walls in the mountains, to show everyone that by God's favor and assistance the city, which was invincible by man, had been betrayed into the hands of Bohemund and all of Christ's faithful, and captured. Thus, with bolts drawn back and gates standing open on all sides, everyone wondered and rejoiced, since Bohemund's plan was not common knowledge. And once awake, they swiftly seized weapons, one warned the other, and everyone armed on the run and hurried to enter the city and gates. There was time for someone to run a mile before the whole number of Christians was admitted. Soon the Turks were stupefied by the violent crash and din of so many thousands going in, and the fearful sound of trumpets, and the widespread raising of banners, the loud shouting of armed men, the neighing of horses, and some who were still asleep in bed, woke up unprepared and unarmed. A part of them got together at once in the hope of resisting, grabbing bows and weapons. Others remained steadfastly on the towers and defenses and shot with arrows many careless Christians of the non-combatant crowd, men and women. Charges and various fights took place among them and were decided by the random chance of war. The Christians, whose strength and forces were great and growing stronger and stronger, were putting to the sword the Turks who were scattered and roaming through homes, through streets and quarters of the town. They spared none of the Gentile kind on grounds of age or sex, until the earth was covered with blood and the corpses of the slaughtered, many of them also the killed and lifeless bodies of Christians, Gauls as well as Greeks, Syrians and Armenians mixed together. No wonder, since there had still been darkness over the earth, with the light scarcely discernible, and they were entirely unaware whom they should spare or whom they should strike, for very many Turks and Saracens, fearing for their lives, deceived the pilgrims with speech and tokens of the Christian faith, and so they lost their lives in the common massacre. There were 10,000 killed, whose bodies lay all over the quarters and streets of the town, and had been killed by the Gauls' weapons. Okay, so the picture we're getting from Albert of Aachen, same basic consistent thing as what the Gesta says, but with different details. So Albert of Aachen says that when they got into the city and they were going around killing the Turks, there was this din, there was this uproar, and the local Christian population, the Greeks, Syrians, Armenians. My mouse got small again. Oh, that's the. It's Inkscape is doing that. Sorry about that. Meanwhile, so the Greeks, Syrians, Armenians, the Christians living in the city rushed out to help the Crusaders. They went around opening the gates. There was another account, I can't remember which one, that said that they joined in killing the Turks. And then further down, oh yeah, in this part, with bolts drawn back and gates standing open on all sides, everyone wondered and rejoiced. That's referring to the Crusaders outside in the camp, because they didn't know. Bohemund's plan was not well known among the Crusaders. So this happened in the middle of the night, or the early hours of the morning when it was still dark, and they were woken up by this clamor. And then when they saw that the gates were open, they started rushing in. They would rush to grab their weapons and rushed into the city. And then over here, it's talking about the Turks. The Turks inside the city were finding out what was happening. They rushed to get their weapons and were rushing around trying to. In some cases, they didn't have time to get their weapons and armor, and they were fighting. And it says a part of the Turks got together at once in the hope of resisting, grabbing bows and weapons. Other Turks remained steadfastly on the towers and defenses and shot with arrows many careless Christians of the non-combatant crowd, men and women. So according to Albert of Aachen, Turks were up on the battlements and up on the towers, shooting down into the crowd of Christian inhabitants. And then it talks about how people were, it was dark. People couldn't tell who was enemy and who was friend. People were getting killed by friendly fire. It talks about Crusaders were getting killed alongside the local Christians. That's what it says here. Gauls, as well as Greeks, Syrians, and Armenians. So the Gauls are the Crusaders from France. And there were people throughout the street, dead bodies throughout the streets of Turks and of Christians throughout the streets. So that and he says, well, no wonder, because it was dark and it was, chaotic. And then at the end there were bodies strewn throughout the streets. So that's what that says. The way Albert of Aachen describes it, to me, it sounds like carnage, but not the way Casagranda described it. Not like a raging bloodlust, but rather just absolutely violent, bloody confusion of people just killing people at half random. Yeah, that's right. And I would say that I don't think there's any primary source that would reflect, or any eyewitness account that would reflect Dr. Casagranda's perspective. The idea that they went into the city in order to kill everybody, and they didn't care if they were Christians or Muslims. They just wanted to kill people because they just loved killing people. It's just so fun for Crusaders because Crusaders aren't human. He never comes out and says that the Crusaders are not human or whatever, but the way he talks about them, he dehumanizes them. But so, yeah, in the primary sources, it's this idea of there was this like mayhem and people were getting killed. They were targeting the Turks, and they absolutely killed every Turk they could find, they could get a hold of. Now, was that because they were racist or because they hated Islam? No, it's because the Turks were combatants. They were potential combatants. You can't trust them. Well, I don't know. I'm not saying that. Maybe they were racist toward Turks. I don't know. But it makes sense in the context of warfare that you would be killing every Turk you came across. But this idea that the Crusaders just went in and killed everybody, that's not there. And so where along the chain did this happen? It's not in the primary sources. It's not, let me switch back to the other view. It's not in the primary sources. And it's not really in Runciman. It kind of is in Runciman. Go back to Runciman. It's kind of in Runciman, but it's not until you get to Amin Maalouf's position in the chain that you get this, it's implied that everybody in the city was getting killed. It didn't matter if they were Muslim or Christian. The Crusaders just wanted to kill everybody just because. And then you get over to Dr. Casagranda, and he elaborates it even further. He stresses and makes it explicit that the Crusaders were killing everybody. They exterminated the entire population. And then he puts those words in Shams ad-Dawlah's mouth of like, why are they doing this? He's astonished. Part of the reason I wanted to show you Albert of Aachen, and Albert of Aachen saying that the Turks were shooting from the towers, shooting the Christians of the city. It's not because that definitely happened, because it might not have happened. Maybe Albert of Aachen is mistaken. Or maybe it happened for a moment. It happened, like he happened to see that happen, but maybe that wasn't a general thing that was happening. Maybe the Turks weren't aiming at the inhabitants. But I wanted to put that in there because when I read that, I was like, oh, because comparing that to what Dr. Roy Casagranda says, because Dr. Roy Casagranda, he says, oh, let me switch back over. So that's Runciman's account. Dr. Roy Casagranda says that Shams ad-Dawla was up in the citadel looking down and watching the Crusaders kill them, and he's shocked. Like, why would you do such a horrible thing? So there's this contrast between Dr. Roy Casagranda's version of the Turks and Albert of Aachen's version of the Turks. But Shams ad-Dawla, I would say, definitely did not say, why are they killing everybody in the city? Wouldn't they want somebody to tax, somebody to do work for them? Because they did not kill everybody in the city. There's no primary source that says they killed everybody in the city. It says they killed every Turk that they could get their hands on, not that they killed everybody in the city. Dr. Roy Casagranda is just wrong. Now, is this because he's maybe it's simply based on he read Amin Maalouf and derived the wrong assumption from it or something? I don't know. It's funny Casagranda asks a critical thinking question, but just accepts that they killed everyone as fact. What's the critical thinking question that you're... Because I have one in mind, but I haven't mentioned it yet, so I don't think that's probably what you're referring to. People 1,000 years ago were people. I know it shouldn't need to be said, but this is something that kind of I didn't think about before. When I did the reaction stream a year ago, I wasn't really thinking about that, or maybe I was, but I was like, whatever, he's just being annoying. But this time, I really started thinking about it. He really is dehumanizing the Crusaders. He doesn't come out and say it in so many words, but the way he talks about them consistently throughout the lecture, they love killing people for no other reason than just to kill them. They're constantly lying and backstabbing, and for no reason. They just do, because that's what they do. They ate people. He talks about the cannibalism event in Ma'ara, which is a crazy event. It was very scandalous at the time and since. He doesn't even try to explain, like, why would they have done that. He says that they did it, and the implication seems to me almost like, well, of course they did, because they're animals. So I was starting to get the feeling, man, he really is dehumanizing them. He's turning them into non-humans in his rhetoric. And I started to feel a little bit icky at that point. Little butter. I will say there are a lot of people I've interacted with who are maybe a little too pleased at some of the destruction of World War II, at least in terms of civilian casualties. Yes, and I would say we should not underestimate how much of that could have existed in medieval Europe too, because again, they're human beings, and human beings are often quite awful. I personally get the impression a lot of the knights from the Middle Ages are kind of like bros. I get a really strong bro energy from those guys, and so it wouldn't surprise me that some of them would have that kind of attitude, going up against an enemy. Punk Ferret, like he asked why they would kill everyone. Oh yeah, that's yeah, right. He asked why they would kill everyone. There's no one to tax. Which should make the claim they killed everyone at least unlikely. Yes. Perfect. Exactly. He didn't even question. And this kind of touches on something I said the last time I reacted to, is like, this sounds crazy. Maybe check, maybe like look into it. He somehow got it into his head. Amin Maalouf does not tell him explicitly that they killed everyone in the city. Somehow he got that into his head. And instead of checking on it and be like, well, maybe I should go read, he could have gone and pulled Runciman off. Well, maybe he doesn't have it on his shelf, but he could have gone to the library. I'm sure they have it at the Austin Community College Library. He could have gone to the library and gotten a copy, or he could have gone down to UT and to their library. They definitely have Runciman, and he could have read what Runciman said. Because Runciman doesn't even say that this is Runciman right here. Runciman doesn't say they killed everybody in the city. So somehow Dr. Roy Casagranda got it into his head that they killed everybody in the city. He did not question that. And then he's posing these questions in the voice of Shamsadawla. Why would they be doing that? Why is that so crazy? And that's what I'm saying. Like, I feel like he feels like he doesn't have to go farther in investigating that. Like, why would they kill everybody so that they don't have anybody to work for them or to tax? And he doesn't question the fact that they would kill everybody in the city anyway, even though they would not have anyone that could work for them or to tax them. He's comfortable with that just being the thing that the Crusaders did, again, because I think he just doesn't see them as human beings. He sees them as animals. Like, we wouldn't ask this if a pack of animals gone into Antioch and killed everybody in the city. We wouldn't say, well, why did the pack of bears or something? Why did the pack of bears not keep some people alive so they could tax them? We wouldn't question that because we don't expect bears to even think about taxes. He seems to think the Crusaders are the same way. All right. So was there anything else about Antioch that I was going to talk about? I don't think so. I will say, I'll just take a little jab at Runciman really quick. In the footnote here, I don't think my arrow's showing up, is it? Oh, now it is. In the footnote here, Sir Stephen Runciman, lists the source. He talks about the sources he used. So he says he used the Gesta Francorum. He used Raymond of Aguilera, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. I've never had an opportunity to find out how Aguilera is supposed to be pronounced. But he references Raymond of Aguilera. He says he used that for certain details that are not in the Gesta Francorum. It's actually a very brief account, but it does have some details that are in the Gesta. And then he's Fulcher of Chartres. That's another name I've never known how to pronounce. Fulcher of Chartres. Gives a briefer account. And then William of Tyre's account. And he said William of Tyre is long but full of unreliable details. And then he also says Ibn al-Athir used that for the Yagusian part. Ibn al-Athir was an Arab historian. So William of Tyre, he says William of Tyre's account is long but full of unreliable details. And I think that's a little bit ironic, because reading through his account of the of this event, he's pulling details from William of Tyre. Some of the more lurid stuff is coming from William of Tyre. So I thought that was kind of, if he thinks he's unreliable, well, apparently he's not unreliable when he's making the Crusaders look bad. So now let's move over to the sack of Jerusalem part. That's over here. That should be about right. Let me check and look at this here. Okay, so we are going to look at Raymond of Aguilera for this part. We'll go ahead and pull it up so we can jump over to it. I think. All right, so yeah, first let's listen to what he says. Then we'll look at, I don't remember if Runciman, I'm trying to remember now what all this. Yes, so we're gonna listen to what he says, then we'll look at Amin Maalouf, then we'll look at Runciman, then we'll look at the primary sources. Okay.
The Jews inside alive. And then they go to the two Christian quarters. And of course, at this point, the Christian population...
Let me back up and clarify. Let me just set the scene. So we are at the end of the First Crusade. The Crusaders, they laid siege to Jerusalem, and then after a while they storm the walls and get into the city, and they capture the city, and there's general mayhem, and they're killing Muslims, and they killed Jews, and there's fighting at the Temple Mount, and a bunch of people get killed on the Temple Mount. So there's all that's going on, right? So that's the context of where we are right now.
And then they go to the 2 Christian quarters. And of course, at this point, the Christian population is peeing itself because it's just watched half the city get exterminated. And they go, you have the true cross, where is it? And the Christians go, we're not telling you. You're savages. And the Crusaders go, okay, we got you. And they start murdering the Christian clergy. They're like, who's a priest? Let's have your priest. And they just start slaughtering the priests. And they're like, when we're done, we're going to do the deacons. And then we're going to start working on your families. Eventually, somebody tells them, here's the true cross, please stop killing us. And they stop massacring the Christians as well. But then they turn to the Christians and go, remember that great schism in 1058? These Catholic priests are your new priests. Get used to it. We're not doing that anymore. Your Orthodox ways are out. And they're like, yeah, whatever. And that's how the Crusaders captured Jerusalem. Isn't that a heartwarming story?
Okay. So, 2 Christian quarters make a Christian $50. That's right. Yeah. And so, yeah, if you've seen my other reaction, I reacted to that. Yeah, it's a story, all right. Yeah. That did not happen because, as I said in the other stream, the Christian quarters, the Christians had been expelled from the city. So there were no Christians in the city at the time of the sack. So this conversation could not have happened. Okay, but I think I've identified the genealogy of this story. It's a similar sort of thing as the story about Antioch, where he read Amin Maalouf, and then he's mangling it. Notice with the Antioch story, he read what Amin Maalouf said. He doesn't just repeat what Amin Maalouf said. He has his own story, right, that he creates, like about they're killing everybody in the city, exterminating everybody in the city, and then Shamsa-Dawla says, why are they doing this? Shamsa-Dawla apparently is this humanitarian who's like, oh no, these poor people, these poor Christians, we loved the Christians so much. Why would they do that to them? But Shamsa-Dawla is like, why are they doing this? They're not going to tax them. So he read Amin Maalouf and somehow took away from that they exterminated the entire city. And then he creates this new story based on that factoid. Okay. Likewise here, I think it's a similar thing happening. He read Amin Maalouf and he's doing his own thing with it. And then Amin Maalouf actually did the same thing. So both, like, when it arrives at Amin, like, there are multiple stages where the information gets mangled, coming from the primary sources to Runciman to Amin Maalouf to Dr. Roy Casagranda. So by the time you get to Dr. Roy Casagranda, it's completely fictionalized. So according to Dr. Roy Casagranda, they went into the Christian quarters of the city. Christians were terrified because they'd seen the Muslims and Jews get massacred. And now they think it's their turn next. The Christians come in, the Crusaders come in, they start killing the Christians. He says that. They've already gotten started before they tell them what they want. Then they say, we're going to keep killing the Christians, you Christians, until you tell us where the true cross is. And then their response is, we're not going to do that. You're monsters. Right? Let's go back. Let's go back to that part. I want to make sure I get that right.
Please.
And the right, yeah.
Oh, burn. And then they go to the 2 Christian quarters. And of course, at this point, the Christian population is peeing itself because it's just watched half the city get exterminated. And they go, you have the true cross, where is it?
Okay.
And the Christians go, we're not.
I'm glad I checked it again. They make the demand first, then they start killing the Christians, right?
Telling you, you're savages. And the Crusaders go, okay, we got you. And they start murdering the Christian clergy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So they go into the Christian quarter. They say, we want the true cross. Give us the true cross. They say, no, we're not going to give it to you because you are savages. That's the reason they won't give it to them. And so then they start killing the Christian clergy. And they tell them, we're going to keep killing you guys. And when we're done, when we run out of priests to kill, we're going to kill the deacons and we're going to kill the families. And then finally somebody relents and shows them where the true cross is. So that's Dr. Roy Casagranda's version. Right, so that's that. Now let's look at Amin Maalouf. So Amin Maalouf, this is his account of that same thing. Not even their co-religionists were spared. One of the first measures taken by the French, but he's using the Arabic name for Franks. One of the first measures taken by the French was to expel from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre all the priests of Oriental rites, Greeks, Georgians, Armenians, Copts, and Syrians, who used to officiate jointly in accordance with an old tradition respected by all previous conquerors. Dumbfounded by this degree of fanaticism, the dignitaries of the Oriental Christian communities decided to resist. They refused to tell the occupiers where they had hidden the true cross on which Christ died. In the minds of these men, religious devotion to the relic was compounded by patriotic pride. Indeed, were they not fellow citizens of the Nazarene? But the invaders were not impressed. They arrested the priests who had been entrusted with custody of the cross and tortured them to make them reveal the secret. Thus did the French manage to forcibly deprive the Christians of the holy city wherein lay their most precious relics. Okay. This is very different from Dr. Roy Casagranda's account. To the extent that I cannot be 100% sure that this is where this is the basis for it. Because, of course, Dr. Roy Casagranda said they were killing the priests, and they told the Christians, we're going to kill all of you. And what Amin Maalouf says is they tortured the priests until they told them where it was located. And then another thing to note is the reason why. Oh, he does get he's getting some of his. We'll skip the. He's misunderstanding stuff. Amin Maalouf gets everything wrong, so it's kind of redundant to point out individual things. But I will note here that the reason in Amin Maalouf's version, why did they not want to hand over the true cross? They didn't want to hand over the true cross because of the Crusaders' religious intolerance. That's how he phrases it. So for Dr. Roy Casagranda, they didn't want to hand over the true cross because they believed that the Crusaders were savages. Because they were going around massacring everybody. What a horrible thing to do. That's so terrible. Why would you do that? Anyway, you're a savage person. You're savages. We're not going to give them to you. In Amin Maalouf's version, it's you're religiously intolerant. Because we had a good thing going on in the church where all of us from all these different churches, even though we're not in communion with each other, for some reason we're all celebrating the divine liturgy. That's absurd. He says, I'm sorry, I wasn't gonna, okay, so he says, all the priests of Oriental rites, Greeks, Georgians, Armenians, Copts, and Syrians, who used to officiate jointly. No, they did not. There are different altars in different parts of the church, and different churches get different zones. The Armenians and the Georgian, the Armenians and the Copts and some of the Syrians were in communion with each other. Then the Greeks and some of the Syrians were in communion with each other, and the Georgians. But they were separate. They're separate communions, and they're not in communion with each other. They would never jointly officiate. Anyway. But dumbfounded by this degree of fanaticism, they refused to hand over the true cross. So that's Amin Maalouf's version of why they didn't want to do it. Where is he getting this from? Because he's not reading Frankish primary sources. He's reading Arabic primary sources, but I believe he's relying on Runciman. Here's Runciman's version of the event. When they had been ejected from the city by Iftikhar, certain of the Orthodox priests had taken with them the holiest relic of the Church of Jerusalem, the major portion of the true cross. They were unwilling to hand it over now to a pontiff who ignored their rights. It was only by the use of torture that Arnold forced its guardians to reveal where they had hidden it. So, again, Runciman is saying it was torture. He tortured. He doesn't specify exactly who Arnulf here. Arnulf here for the first time. Yeah, he identifies who exactly is doing the torturing. Because Maalouf just says they, right? The invaders were not impressed. They arrested the priests who had been entrusted with the custody of the cross and tortured them. Doesn't specify who. Runciman specifies who it was. It was Arnulf. And by the way, it's not clear. Oh, anyway, that's a separate thing. I don't want to get off track. So Arnulf was the. Sure, I'm getting this. Okay. Arnulf was the newly appointed Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem. And one of the things he tried to do was to figure out where the true cross was so that he could set it up, presumably to set it up in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for devotions. I don't know. So this is what Runciman says. Runciman identifies that it was Arnulf that was doing this. Arnulf made the choice to torture the Orthodox priests. He specifies that it's Orthodox priests that he's torturing. So he's being more precise than Amin Maalouf is. Now let's go back and let me see what I was going to talk about. What of these do I want to read first? Actually, I have two. Let's do Raymond first. Okay, so I feel like I'm watching Memento or something because we're going backwards. So this is, or because I can't remember anything. All right, so this is Raymond of Aguilar, another eyewitness account. Upon our return to Jerusalem so in Raymond, it's clear this is happening after the siege. In, like the siege is over, the sack is over, the Christians are in control of Jerusalem. This is clearly something that happened after that. Like that's what the primary sources say. In Runciman, that's still the case. In Runciman, there's one chapter that's about the sack of Jerusalem, and then the next chapter is about the power struggle that happened afterward and how they arranged the power structure of the new kingdom of Jerusalem. That's the next chapter over. That's where Runciman has this little blurb about how Arnulf tortured Orthodox priests to get them to tell him where the true cross was located. And yeah, so that's that. So it's clear in Runciman, because it's a totally different chapter, it's clear this has nothing to do with the sack of Jerusalem. It's not happening during that time. In Amin Maalouf, though, it's not actually clear. I was reading through it, and he doesn't actually wind up the sack. He's just sort of like saying bad things that happened during the sack of Jerusalem, and then he just sort of like, it's just sort of like there's, I don't know. It's just from in the context, it is not clear that this incident where the invaders, generically tortured the local Christians generically to reveal where the true cross was located. It's actually not clear. When I read it, it wasn't clear that this was not part of the sack. This was something else. So that might be part of the... See, this is part of the reason why I think Dr. Roy Casagranda is basing his made-up story on what he read in Amin Maalouf, specifically. Because Amin Maalouf is not clear that this is not actually taking place during the sack of Jerusalem. Because we're going backwards and presumably closer toward a reality. Okay. This is not because I'm having senior moments. All right. So, where are we? Yeah. So this is Raymond. This is Raymond of Aguilar's account. Upon our return to Jerusalem after this task, Arnulf, chaplain of the Count of Normandy, was elected by some as patriarch, contrary to the wishes of the good clergyman, who objected on the grounds that he was not a subdeacon and was of priestly origin. In other words, he's saying, this is kind of a longer thing, so I'm going to kind of stop along the way rather than try to remember everything I want to comment on. Arnulf had come along on the First Crusade because he was chaplain to the Count of Normandy, and there were objections to his election, partly because he did not have the proper clerical rank. He's being appointed way above his station, because he says here he was not a subdeacon. I don't get that. I thought he was a subdeacon based on what else I've read. It was my understanding he was a subdeacon, which was part of what was called minor orders, which no longer exists in the Catholic Church. But there was these ranks of minor orders. So he was he was in the minor orders. He was not an ordained priest. And yet he's being appointed to become Patriarch of Jerusalem, one of the highest ranking episcopal offices of the entire church. So there were objections on those grounds. Also on the grounds that his father was a priest. And so somehow that was a stigma. I don't really know why, but for some reason that was a stigma. And then, so that's so far. And then there's another issue. To cap it all off, to continue Raymond's account, to cap it all, he was accused of being a philanderer on the journey, even to the point that he was the object of smutty stories. So there were rumors that he was engaged in sexual misconduct. So he was regarded as all around, for Raymond, the good clergyman, considered him all around a bad candidate for the office. And then Raymond continues, needless to say, the ambitious Arnulf ignored canonical decrees, his disgraceful birth and lack of conscience, berated the good clergy, and had himself elevated to the patriarchal see to the accompaniment of hymns, chants, and great applause of the people. Arnulf was not frightened by the divine punishment of the Bishop of Martirana, the inciter and director of Arnulf's elevation, for he continued to take benefices from the clergymen who had altars in the Lord's sepulchre or from those who received fees for its care. That's a reference to the Bishop of Martirana was a bishop who was, instrumental in the election of Arnulf. Later on, he got captured by the Turks and nobody heard from him again. So he's saying, well, he didn't learn the lesson, like what happens to you if you're a bad bishop. And he went on to be a bad bishop by taking, using his office to enrich himself, according to Raymond. Once in power, Arnulf sought to locate, with the help of the inhabitants, the cross worshipped by pilgrims before the Turkish capture of Jerusalem. They knew nothing of its location, going so far as to prove their words by oath and other signs, but they were finally forced to say, "Revelation shows that you are God's chosen people, that you have been freed from trials and given Jerusalem and many other cities, not by your great strength, but by a wrathful God who blinded the blasphemers. The Lord your leader threw open the gates of impregnable cities and won terrifying battles for you. Since God is on your side, why should we obstinately hide his relics from you?" Then, after leading the Crusaders to a hall in the church, they uncovered and surrendered the cross. So we were glad and praised and thanked Almighty God, who not only restored, etc., etc. Okay, so I would say, if I might editorialize, I dare say there's some stuff going on between the lines that we are not, that Raymond is not being forthright about. Let me get caught up on chat and then I'll come back to that. Must have been a very charming man. The thing is, though, a lot of people supported his election and cheered. Like, Raymond even says up here, as much as Raymond obviously doesn't like the guy, he says that when he was elevated to the office, there was great applause of the people. Presumably people in Normandy's entourage, or men of Normandy, right? That's the kind of, I would assume that's the kind of alignment that people would have, that you would support the guy who's part of your faction. Okay, this, as far as I know, I was only able to locate two primary sources that talk about this. When you look at, where is it? 294. Okay, yeah, I did not. Oh, yeah, I do have. You can look along with me on this part. So what I want to do is I want to connect Runciman. Where is Runciman getting his information, and how is he changing it? Okay, so we're at that chain, right? At that link of the chain. Did I grab? Yes, I did. I do have the entire pages. Oh, Are we on? I can move this around. All right. So we need to look at the footnote, and the footnote is actually on the next page. This is his information. This is where he's getting it. Footnote number 1. Raymond of Aguilera, lock site, location cited. Fulcher of Chartres, and it gives a reference for that, and then William of Tyre. Or Fulcher must be Fulcher of Chartres. I have the misfortune of having the 2 chroniclers whose names I don't know how to pronounce are the ones that I have to talk about. So Raymond is the one we just read. And then there's Fulcher of Chartres, and I have him. So let's jump over to him. That is, where is that? I think I have that. Right here. Yep. So let me read his account. At that time it pleased God that a small piece of the Lord's cross should be found in a secret place. It had been hidden in ancient times by holy men. And now, by the will of God, it was discovered by a certain Syrian, who with the knowledge of his father had carefully concealed and preserved it. This piece, fashioned in the form of a cross, partly covered by gold and silver work, they all carried aloft to the Lord's sepulchre and thence to the temple, singing triumphantly and giving thanks to God, who through blah, 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 blah. All right, so I did not have time before the stream to look up William of Tyre. I was trying to do that. I was doing that on the Internet Archive, and it was laggy. The pages weren't loading. I just ran out of time. I wasn't able to check what William of Tyre says. But these are the 3 primary sources that Runciman says he's getting this information from for this account. And I'm not aware of it happening anywhere else. These are the only 3 places I know of it, or, you know, because he says these are the 3 places, and I read 2 of them. So what are these 2 primary sources saying? In Raymond of Aguilera's account, it says that Arnulf wanted to locate the true cross, and so sought to locate with the help of the locals where the true cross was located. And then there's somehow Raymond's being weird in the way he's telling this story. The story doesn't make any sense. He says they didn't know where it was, and then they said, well, you know what? You guys have been guided by God this whole trip. You've done these marvelous things that could only be done by God's intervention. Therefore, why would we ever keep this away from you? And so then they reveal where it's located. So I don't know why Raymond's being weird about it. But so they lead the Crusaders to a hall in the church, and they uncover the cross and hand it over. Now there's nothing in here about torture, and there's nothing in what's the other guy? Fulcher. There's nothing in Fulcher's account about torture. So where is Runciman getting torture? I would say he's making a reasonable inference in that, like, okay, hold on. Let me back up a second. Fulcher and Raymond are saying 2 different things. So they can't both be true. One of them is true and one of them is not true, probably. Wait, let me think about this. Let me go back and look at Fulcher again. Fulcher says, at that time, it pleased God. It had been hidden in ancient times by holy men. So he said the true cross had been hidden for a long time. And then a certain Syrian, who with the knowledge of his father had carefully concealed and preserved it. Okay, yeah. So a certain Syrian had concealed it and kept it safe, and it had been kept hidden for a long time. That seems to be what he says. And then it was revealed. So Fulcher of Chartres doesn't say anything about Arnulf's investigation or torturing Orthodox priests. The Syrian is an Orthodox person. So he doesn't say it didn't happen. He just doesn't say anything about it. If this were the only account we had, there would be no basis for saying that there had been any resistance at all, because according to this doesn't record any resistance having occurred. So if this were the only account about this incident that survived, we would have no reason to imagine that, like, we would just imagine that the Crusaders took the city and then this Syrian guy went and showed them where the true cross was and be like, well, that's the end of it. The question mark, as far as I'm concerned, based on what I've seen so far, comes where you look at Raymond of Aguilar's account, because he's being kind of cagey about it, and it's kind of, and I don't know, there's no reason why he'd be cagey on the, I don't know. Is he being cagey because they got tortured and he didn't want to say that they were tortured? I don't know, maybe, but like, in general, the chroniclers don't seem to have a problem with saying that Christians got killed and stuff, so I don't know. But strictly speaking, in this account, there doesn't seem to be any reference to torture. The closest thing we have here is when it says they knew nothing of its location, going so far as to prove their words by oath and other signs. And we could say that maybe there is some oblique reference to torture there. Maybe there is a reference in William of Tyre. Maybe William of Tyre says there was torture, and I wasn't able to verify that. Or maybe, in time for this stream. Or maybe Runciman is just assuming that there was torture, because why else? Now, with regard to the status of the churchmen, like the clergy in the church, that is referenced here, because it says up in the previous paragraph, didn't it? Or am I misremembering? He kicked them out. Didn't he kick them out of the church? Yeah, right here. For he continued to take benefices away from clergymen who had altars in the Lord's sepulchre, or from those who received fees for its care. He was kicking people out of the church. That's what that meant. Clergy were assigned to certain, roles in the church, and that's called and that would be associated with an income stream. That's called a benefice. That was how clergy were paid in the Middle Ages. You would have like a church, for example, you'd have a parish church, and there'd be an income stream associated with that parish. And so you would go there as a priest, and you'd live off the income stream that was associated with the parish. So the parish might, like there'd be some lands that were owned by the parish. There might be some kind of like legal arrangement where peasants have to work on those lands a certain number of days of the year or whatever. And then the income from those lands would pay for the church building and for the priest. And then you'd also have a situation where you'd have like a second layer where you'd have the official benefice holder, and then you'd have somebody who would go and, like, sometimes you would have the income stream assigned to an individual who was not physically located on the premises. He'd be located somewhere else, and then he would hire another priest to go and work for him in that parish, but he would live somewhere else, living off the income. So that's the benefices. I think this is the reference to them getting kicked out of the church. I'm just like, this is still new material to me. Like, I was like learning this over the past couple days right before this stream, and I hadn't thought through all of this. I had read in the second, because there's also, I was looking at this other book, which is much more reliable than Runciman, this Tyreman's book on the Crusades. I looked in there too, and I think he also says Arnulf kicked them out of the church. I assume that's what happened. But now I'm trying to think, how do I know that Arnulf kicked them all out of the church, and why? Because I'm just now realizing, according to Raymond of Aguilar, he kicked them out of the church because he wanted their benefices. He wanted those income streams. Not because of church politics or because he was Catholic and they were Orthodox or whatever. At least that's what Raymond says. What the real reason was is a separate issue. But what the primary sources actually tell us is this. And the other source for this, Fulcher of Chartres, doesn't say anything about that. So I would need to see William of Tyre to know for sure, but it's possible that Runciman dreamed up the part where it's like it was all about Catholic versus Orthodox, which of course would play into his prejudice that Catholics are evil and Orthodox are good because the Orthodox are what the Byzantines were, and the Byzantines were the most amazing civilization that's ever existed, right? And the Catholics fought against the Byzantines. That makes the Catholics bad. They were finally forced to say, right, oh yeah, that's that part too. They were finally forced to say, whatever that means. Right, the tithes also, correct. Anastasia sounds toxic. Which part sounds toxic? Oh yeah, the Brotherhood of the Cruciform Sword. I was going to mention that, and then I decided not to. Antioch. So remember when we were talking about Antioch earlier on in the stream? And it's the modern city of Hatay. Here is Alexandretta from the movie, from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. And the Canyon of the Crescent Moon would be somewhere out here. Of course, the topography has to be different, but somewhere out here is the Canyon of the Crescent Moon. So if you're interested in having eternal life but having to sit in the room for the rest of eternity, that's where you go. Oh, hiring out priest work. Oh, from a pastoral point of view, you mean? Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. MLM really? No, it's not MLM. It's like hiring a personal assistant kind of thing, or like hiring out. It's like when people today hire people to do things on their behalf. It's that kind of thing. As long as the sacraments are being done, it doesn't really matter from the standpoint of the people who go to the church, as long as the vicar, I believe I'm using that terminology correctly, as long as the guy who's actually there and doing the sacraments and actually present with the people, as long as he's a good pastor, everything's fine. The issue comes from people abusing that. What would happen is you would have church officials who would have multiple benefices from multiple locations, even multiple bishoprics. And they'd be, deriving income from all these places. And then they would hire guys, to manage those different locations church-wise. But you have these guys who are making a lot of money. And what service, like what service are they really doing for the flock when they're doing that, And so this was a perennial issue of like concern for reform in the church, is like, we need to do something about this system. But the system, it's sometimes it's hard to fix a system, because systems are, ingrained and stuff. And installing a man who has been accused of all sorts of smut as a patriarch of a newly conquered city does sound like a measure to keep the people down. I don't think it was to keep the people down. I don't know for sure. I don't know, people down. I mean, somebody was going to be patriarch. The hierarchy was going to be there no matter what. I assume he was appointed for political reasons. The natural appointee, the natural man for the job, was Adhemar of Le Puy, but he had died on the journey. But he was universally respected, supported by pretty much all the factions of the First Crusade. If he had survived all the way to Jerusalem, without a doubt, he would have become the Latin Patriarch. The issue was, once they got there, all the good men for the job were gone. And so they just didn't have good options. That's my understanding. And it became a political decision. Did priests do sermons back then? That's a really good question. Not necessarily. That kind of thing changed a lot over time, and so I can't say specifically for the end of the 11th century was that a thing that they were doing. But we can't, like, it would not necessarily be the case, because there were stages of the history of Christianity where it was not typical for sermons to be done at the liturgical celebration. The lack of dark mode. Yes, yeah, my apologies. I threw all this together really fast, and did not have time to fix the backgrounds on the slides, so I just went with the default, because I basically started these slides last night. The little bay in the north of the map lines up suspiciously with the peninsula on the northeast of Cyprus. Well, I guess plate tectonics proved, right? I guess plate tectonics was continental drift was right. Like, they turned out being right. That whole conspiracy theory about plate tectonics ends up being right. All right. What have we looked at? So yeah, we looked at the two primary sources. So if we look at the chain of transmission here, the game of telephone that's happened, I can't say conclusively, what is that bay called? OpenStreetMap, unfortunately, be a little weird about this. Where the labels are. I don't know if it, I don't know. I don't know what that's called. The Bay of Alexandretta. Is that possibly it? Gulf of Alexandretta. That's what it is. Okay, so where were we? Right. Game of telephone. So we have the two primary sources. Neither of them says there was torture. Raymond kind of implies it. You know, I think it's a reasonable inference from reading Raymond of Aguilar that torture was involved somehow. And for whatever weird reason, Raymond's being cagey about it. But who do they torture? When do they torture? Why do they torture? Why were they not willing to hand it over? Obviously, Arnulf was involved, and that's all we know. We don't know why the the account doesn't even use the word Orthodox. Let's be to be fair, we're focusing on this Great Schism issue. Dr. Roy Casagranda frames it in Great Schism issue in the context of the Great Schism. That's not how the First Crusade chroniclers talked about it. They didn't talk about Catholics and Orthodox. They talked about Gauls, in that one account, or they would talk about the Franks or French or whatever. And then they would talk about the Greeks and the Syrians and the Armenians, and each of them had their ecclesiastical hierarchies. But he says that the local priests, the Raymond of Aguilar says the local priests. But wait, let's be careful about this. Let me make sure about this. So where was that one? Right here. What does he actually say? Arnulf sought to locate the true cross with the help of the inhabitants. They swore up and down they didn't know where it was. and then they changed their mind and led the Crusaders to a hall in the church where they uncovered and surrendered the cross. So Raymond of Aguilar does not specify. He just says inhabitants. And then the other one, Fulcher of Chartres, says it was a particular Syrian individual. It doesn't specify that he's a priest. So, come to think of it, neither of these guys says that it was the clergy specifically. They just say it was the local Christians. Some local Christian, a single local Christian in the case of Fulcher of Chartres, or some unspecified group of local Christians in the case of Raymond of Aguilar. Then it goes to Runciman, and Runciman says the Orthodox clergy refused to hand it over because their rights were being violated. In the Holy Sepulchre, their rights were being taken away. The Orthodox clergy would be being kicked out, and the Catholic clergy would be being put in. What's our evidence for this? Well, Raymond of Aguilar, for what it's worth, doesn't present it in those terms. He says that the clergy were being forced out of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because of Arnulf's own greed. So it wasn't a Catholic Orthodox thing. And then, according to Raymond of Aguilar, why were they reluctant to hand over the true cross? He doesn't say. And Fulcher of Chartres doesn't say either, because Fulcher of Chartres doesn't even say that they were reluctant to begin with. So apparently Runciman is inventing this idea that they were reluctant to hand it over because they were Orthodox and the Crusaders were Catholic, and they resented the fact that the Pope was not going to honor their benefices in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, their rights in the church. Then you go from Runciman to Amin Maalouf. Maybe I should use a visual aid as I'm going along. So we have Fulcher here. Now we go, so we had Runciman. That was Runciman's deal. Then we go from Runciman to Maalouf. And then in Maalouf, he changes it again. Now it's not Arnulf doing it. Now it's just the Crusaders in general. And they're not targeting the clergy. They're targeting the Christians in general. And the motivation that the Christians have for not handing over the true cross is no longer because their rights are not being respected in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now it's a matter of religious intolerance. Look how intolerant those people are. That's objectionable. We're not going to hand the true cross over to those intolerant people. And then we go from that to Dr. Roy Casagranda, and he changes it again. Now it's not torture. Dr. Roy Casagranda, now it's massacre. They're massacring them. That's a Dr. Roy Casagranda original. At no point in that chain of transmission was it ever about massacring the Christians. Somehow Dr. Roy Casagranda has invented that part. And then what's their motivation for withholding it, for not handing over the true cross? It's because the Crusaders are savages. No longer is it about religious intolerance or closed-mindedness. No longer is it about ecclesiastical rights in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now it's, well, you're savages. You just go around killing people and eating people. You're just horrible creatures. We're not going to hand the true cross to such savages. So I think that's how things, I think that's the chain of transmission. When you get from it's a very different story if you're comparing the primary sources to what Dr. Roy Casagranda is saying through those intermediate steps. All right, well, that is my breakthrough. And I figured out what his deal is. Dr. Roy Casagranda. It's not, oh, he's still making stuff up. He's still inventing things and dreaming things up. Absolutely. But he's doing it in a way that I find easier to understand than I did before. Because before, when I did that reaction stream a year ago, I was so flummoxed. I did not understand how he was creating these stories out of thin air and then thinking that they're real. That was so weird to me. I didn't get it. Now, okay, this is a kind of personality I've encountered before. This is the person who kind of half remembers stuff and gets it wrong, but is not really worried about getting the details wrong, but he knows that the general gist of what he's saying is right. I've met people like that before, you know. Okay, Caligula, more often than not, incompetent history is just a veil for political agitation. Yeah, I think that's kind of what's going on here. I think what's going on with Dr. Roy Casagranda is he has an overarching narrative that he sees all of history through a certain simplistic reductionist lens. And let me just say, by the way, just to reiterate, he is not a historian. He does not have a history degree. He got a PhD, but it's not in history. So he's not, he's not in a position, although to be honest, sometimes people with PhDs in history also engage in reductionist thinking. So it's not a guarantee that's not going to happen. But in the case of Dr. Roy Casagranda, he sees the world in a very simple way. There's oppressors and oppressed, and people of the Middle East are historically oppressed people, and they've been oppressed by Europe. And so that means that the European powers are the bad guys, the Middle Easterners, the Muslims, the Arabs are the good guys, and everything is filtered through that that framework. So when he's telling an anecdote, I'm sure he recognizes that he doesn't exactly remember every detail. But he's still confident. Because remember, one of the things I was struggling with that other stream was, how is he so confident when he's saying these things that he clearly made up? But he reads Amin Maalouf, and that's where he's getting his little nuggets of information. But he feels confident because he believes his superstructure is true. Like this overarching idea that Europe is evil and oppresses people and victimizes people, and the Middle Easterners are innocent victims, and they had this beautiful, amazing civilization, and the Europeans wrecked it. And so, yeah, you might get a detail wrong here or there. This incident, for example, oh, yeah, fine, it didn't happen during the sack. It happened after the sack. Okay, fine, it wasn't a massacre. He was just he was just going to torture some people. He wasn't going to massacre the entire Christian population of Jerusalem. Fine. Slight difference, but the overall idea is still true in his mind, which is that they're evil and they do evil things, and the Muslims and the Middle Eastern Christians are innocent, and they're being attacked and mistreated by these horrible outsiders from Europe. And so the upshot of the story is still true, even if the story itself is not. So, yeah, he got the details wrong here, but the upshot of the story is, look at how evil these people are, and look at how unfair they treated people in the Middle East, including the Christians there. That upshot is still true no matter what the ingredients are that go into the story. So I think that's what's going on with him. He's like, well, that's why he's confident. That's why he still feels comfortable getting up in front of a classroom and saying stuff, even though he's been called out in the past, even though he has a reputation on Reddit, on Ask Historians and stuff. He has a reputation for being, and in our history, his reputation for doing really terrible history. He's probably aware that people are saying that about him. But he's like, well, the big picture is still true. Caligula, I do find this noble savage perspective not only insulting to the Europeans, but also incredibly patronizing to the non-Europeans. Yeah. Dune. And now he's practically on the tour 24/7 doing Qatari and Saudi royal sponsor speaking events. He is, right. He has that whole thing. He goes over to the United Arab Emirates, to the Museum of the Future, and gives talks there and stuff. Yeah. A fresh rye roll. People try not to treat history as a sports game of heroes and villains challenge impossible. I know. It's really annoying. And sometimes there's a historical topic I won't touch because I know that the team spirit is so strong out in the public that it's not possible for me to talk about that without people trying to, turn it into that. If you take a look at his Twitter, he's basically always at some conference being hosted by Qatari or Saudi royalty. Oh, I don't think I've ever looked at his Twitter feed. But yeah, if you go on his channel, well, we're here, actually. This is his channel. Let's look at it. Here's his channel, Dr. Roy Casagranda. If you look at his videos, this here, which is the one I was looking at. I started watching this one. Cyrus the Great. He did this at the Museum of the Future. He did this in like Abu Dhabi or Dubai or something. This one also, Grace and Tolerance in History, about the Haitian Revolution. Yeah, so he's regularly going over to the Gulf and giving talks. And he's very popular among like looking at his audience on social media, it looks like there's a lot of Muslims in his audience. Yeah, so where I am on this, I feel relieved. I feel much more comfortable with Dr. Roy Casagranda as a thing that exists out there, as an entity that exists out in the world. Because now I understand, now he's a known quantity to me. Before I was so confused and disturbed that he would invent things out of thin air. He still says crazy stuff. But now I feel more comfortable saying, well, he probably read that and only half remembers it. He probably read it in an unreliable book or heard it at a party from somebody else, kind of half remembers it. And then he takes these little bits of information that he's picked up different places and only partly remembers and partly gets wrong. And then he's constructing these storytelling narrative arcs, which is the basis, the building blocks for his talks and his lectures. If he's not a history professor, why is he lecturing on history? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I guess you know what? To be honest, I don't know. Like, his Crusade series is 4 lectures. So either it was a special lecture series that he did as a special event, or it was part of a class. And if it was part of a class, it was part of something else. Now, was that class a history class? I don't know. So it might be interesting to go and find his course catalog, or not the course, find his course schedule and look, does he teach classes that are classified as history classes at that college? Because it might be he's not teaching anything that's officially history class, like that's listed as a history class in the listings. I don't know. Now, but there's another question, which is, why is he giving talks about historical topics when he's not a historian? And that's because the general public, most people, present company accepted, most people don't know anything about history. They don't know what historical expertise looks like or sounds like. And the fact that he's confident and, for most people, an enjoyable speaker, and me included, I enjoy watching him talk. Just as a talk, I do find him entertaining. Some people in the comments were like, I don't find him entertaining. Whatever, I find him entertaining. I think he's a great speaker. And he's a good speaker. He's very friendly. He's charismatic, in my opinion. He is, and seems like an easygoing guy from the stuff I've seen, and kind of relatable. He's a professor. This is also, I think, is important for a lot of people. He's relatable in the sense that he's up there and he's speaking confidently, and to the untrained eye, it might seem like he has expertise. At the same time, though, he doesn't seem like distant or, like off-putting or whatever. He seems like the kind of guy that you could go up to and talk to, and he'd be very friendly and very easy, very warm to talk to. So, and also there's another thing too. Why he gets invited to give these talks when he's not qualified, he's not a historian. He tells people what they want to hear. Not in the sense that he's being deceptive, because he believes it too. But he tells, like, he's going to the Gulf, and he's telling people in the Gulf the Islamic civilization is the greatest thing that's ever happened in the history of the world, and every bad thing that's ever happened in Islamic civilization is because of evil baddies from outside. Which, of course, you want to hear that when you're a Muslim, right? That's what all Muslims tell each other. That is the coin of the realm in the Islamic world, is that all the bad things that are happening in the Islamic world is because of those evil imperialists from outside. And all the bad things that are like the evil, like the bad leaders, the dictators, and the military regimes, and all those things that happen within the region are because the outsiders, the outside powers, are propping them up. So he goes there and he gives a plausible sounding historical lecture and confirms all those things. So yeah, once again, like that reinforces this idea that, we want to hear what he has to say. Like, of course they want to hear what he has to say. Optimus Primo, I was wondering why you would not call him a historian. Well, I mean, there are different. So I'm not doctrinaire about the use of the word. So if you consider a historian anyone who teaches or lectures on history, or anyone who's an educator on history, then yeah, he is a historian. Yeah. I was talking about that in the context of what somebody said up above in the chat, where he's like, he didn't get his PhD in history, so why is he teaching history classes? So that was the context in which I was speaking. Oh, I guess I already answered your question. Okay, so this is what you found on their website. Oh yeah, I've read this before. Dr. Roy Casagranda, PhD, is a professor of government at Austin Community College. Yeah, and he has a bunch of different areas. Did an ad hoc interdisciplinary PhD at the University of Texas at Austin, combining political science, philosophy, history, psychology, and Germanic studies. Yeah, I know. His dissertation attempts to explain why non-political actors become revolutionaries. Right. Oh yeah, and then his novel, The Wolf of Verona, which apparently we made a sale for him. Who was it that bought the book? Somebody in the chat bought the book. All right. Okay, Optimus. I've been listening for a few minutes. It appears to me that because he is providing a different perspective than the standard narrative, he's called unqualified. No. I'm talking about qualification in the context of the chat. Qualification in the context of like official credentials. Now, I don't think that you need to have a PhD in history in order to teach history. In order to teach history content in a college classroom. I don't think that's the case. I think, and it comes up in other classes. If you take an English class, there's, English literature class, you're going to have a history component. If you take a high level language class, there's going to be a history component. If you take political science, let's say you take a political science class on presidential elections, there's going to be a historical component to that. Inevitably, that professor is going to have to talk about history as part of the instruction. There's nothing wrong with that. In the context of the question that was posed in chat, if he doesn't have a history PhD, why is he teaching history classes? That was what I was answering, that these might not be officially listed as history classes at Austin Community College. They might be classes in some other department, and he happens to have a historical component that is then being packaged and put on YouTube. That's what I was saying. Optimus, I did find your statements about the Islamic world incorrect. What he does and what makes him interesting to listen to is that he discusses a time period that's completely ignored in contemporary history. It's not contemporary. It's not ignored in contemporary history. Now, if you mean it's not available on YouTube, well, there are other channels that cover this stuff on YouTube. I haven't watched them. I can't vouch, but there's like Epic History, and I can't remember what they all are, but there are different channels on YouTube that cover this kind of stuff. Extra History did a whole series on the Crusades. I don't think this stuff is being ignored. Same with Cyrus the Great. Heterodox in academia. I would not say that what he says is heterodox. Attack, because bear in mind, okay, in context of the Crusades, I don't know if you guys are talking in general or talking about Middle East stuff in general, but when it comes to the Crusades, his depiction of the Crusaders as evil and the Muslims as good is not heterodox in academia. I mean, by the way, it's a moral ruling. It's not something that's really like a historical question, So it's not like historians are sitting around debating were the Crusades good or bad. That's not the kind of thing a historian, qua historian, is going to worry about. But in terms of like what are the attitudes that academics have, Dr. Roy Casagranda is a leftist. He's just a run-of-the-mill, just a regular old leftist. Being pro-Palestine just makes you a leftist. It's not an obscure thing to be pro-Palestine. To be anti-Crusades is not a weird niche thing for an academic to be. It's very common for people in academia to view, especially if they don't work in Crusade studies, like if they work in some other field, their opinion of the Crusades is going to be Dr. Roy Casagranda's opinion of the Crusades 90% of the time. he doesn't represent some obscure, like he's not like fighting this rear guard action, trying to promote this idea that's very like everybody's trying to ignore him or obscure this. No, like this is common. This is like his view, his general attitude regarding the Crusades is the general attitude our culture in general has. He's not out of step with that. Al-Muqaddam. Oh yeah, that's another channel you can watch. Al-Muqaddama. He does tons of stuff on Islamic history. Al-Muqaddama has a recent video called The Third Crusade from Islamic Perspective. There you go. Optimus, go watch Al-Muqaddama's channel. Oh, 3B's Visit a Passion Flower. Yeah, I know. His channel's kind of fun because if you go back, he has these lectures that get tons of views, and then he'll have this little thing where it's like, here's a thing that happened in my backyard, and it has like 5,000 views. And I love that. I feel like it's a more pure version of YouTube. You know, YouTube in its original form was just people sharing stuff. And I appreciate that about his channel, that he has maintained that spirit. Yeah. But all right. Thank you, everybody. See you later.